It is our pleasure to welcome Dr. Patrick Baylis, who is an assistant professor and environmental economist at the University of British Columbia. He studies how people respond to environmental threats like climate change, air pollution, and wildfires, and how public policies might help them respond better. We also have here with us today Michael Wolfe, who is currently serving his second term on Richmond City Council, where he is the leading voice for climate justice in city policies. He has also been a senior science teacher and pressures the Richmond School District to step up their leadership in environmental education. He completed his Bachelor's of Science, Bachelor's of Education, and Master's of Education at UBC and has 2 young children.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for being with us, and thank you, Kalisa, for the introduction. So to get started, we'll ask each of our panelists, so Michael and Patrick, to introduce themselves and their perspectives on climate change for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then we will open the floor for a general discussion and any questions that you might have for our panelists about the topic. So you're welcome and encouraged to post comments or questions in the chat at any time, and we'll keep an eye on it. So with that, we will stop sharing our screen, and I'm going to pass it over to Patrick. Let's start with Patrick to get going. Welcome. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I thought a good way into this conversation for me would be just to talk about a project that I've been working on over the past year that kind of speaks to a lot of these questions, because it is a collaboration between me, who's an academic, and a colleague of mine who's also an academic, and policymakers and regulators who are actively working on issues and challenges related to climate change. So I'll keep this brief, and that'll probably mean skipping around a bit through the slides, but hopefully this will just give you like kind of the flavor for how, academics, economists, social science researchers have started to think about addressing the problem of climate change, and potentially and hopefully continuing to work with people who actually have on the ground responsibilities for managing some of its effects. This project is called Incentivizing Self-Protection from Wildfire, and it's a pilot field experiment, which is to say it's like a kind of first stage of a field experiment on adapting to climate change. So it's joint with my colleague Judson, who's at the University of California, San Diego, and Bob Horton. Bob is both a PhD candidate at Old Dominion University, and he's also a wildfire professional working with the Western Fire Chiefs Association in the American West. So the big picture reason why we're interested in these ideas and why this project is motivating to us from an academic standpoint is that we want to understand what kind of prevents and stands in the way of efficient adaptation to climate damage and climate hazards. A key fact that we want to bring into this conversation is that natural disasters are really low probability and high consequence events. And as social scientists, that should raise some flags for us in terms of how people respond, because as a person moving about their day-to-day life, if you only experience something occasionally, it's sort of hard for you to assess both how likely that event is really going to happen is, and its cost to you. So natural disasters fit this really well. They're exactly the type of problem that humans are not built to deal with very well. There's lots of reasons why economists, think individuals might not be super efficient at adapting to this. I won't belabor this, except to say it sort of comes down to maybe I misperceive the risk. Maybe the incentives you offer me cause me to do something that is inefficient or non-optimal. Maybe the insurance market isn't operating perfectly, or maybe there's like effects that spill over from me to my neighbors. So this has been studied in various areas, but there's really very little work doing kind of experimental examination of this. Okay, here's where I'm going to start kind of skipping through what we're doing here, but the basic kind of backdrop is that people, especially in the Western US and in Western Canada have become increasingly interested in this idea of defensible space, which is just a concept about how much flammable material is near your home. So with apologies, I'll be a little bit quick through this, but all of this slide is to say that, especially places in the West have tried and partly succeeded at starting to legislate this and require this in various areas. But it's not easy to legislate legally or jurisdictionally. So what a lot of places like Oregon, where our study is taking place, have done is that they're trying to motivate this kind of action through voluntary approaches. So these programs exist not just in BC, in the States, but also in BC. For example, this one on the left is actually a picture I took when I was in Rossland last summer. Rossland offers rebates for people who clear fuel around their home. Lots of places in fire-prone areas in the interior and other parts of BC do as well. Okay. The project that we've been working on is just this field experiment with Jackson County Fire District. And our work with them was to explore different ways to contact and get homeowners to get back in touch with their fire district to do some of this mitigation behavior. We randomly allocated homes to both financial and non-financial incentives with an implementation that is designed to really closely match an existing outreach program that they already had. From the academic side, this is, we think, useful because it's the first sort of truly randomized evaluation of a policy that promotes climate adaptation in the context of wildfires. It's also the first one that we know of for policymakers. I would love to tell you all about this, but I don't want to go too far over my time. So we randomized assignment in this district by street. It kind of looks like that. The purple is going to be a control home. So we tried to make sure that control homes were mostly next to control homes, and treatment homes, which are all the other colors, were next to treatment homes. Let me skip through the rest of this and just tell you the kind of two key findings. The first key finding, if you look on the left here, is that we've got a control group where people get no contact, and we have almost no take-up as a result. So this measure of take-up is just whether or not the resident gets back in touch with the fire district. That ended up being about 0.6% of the control homes, not statistically different from zero. If we gave the resident information or moral suasion, this was a little bit higher. These are just treatments where we said, we really think you should do this. Here's why. We sent you a flyer, but there's no incentive offer. Once we start offering money, we started to see bigger incentive offers. This isn't much of a surprise, especially for economists who think that money really matters. But what is a surprise for economists is that when we offered people more money, it did not lead to more take-up. And in fact, it actually led to less. So the $500 group responded less than the $250 group. Honestly, we're still trying to sort this out. It's a pilot project. We're going to explore this more in future work. We think it has something to do with credibility. We think that based on other stuff we saw in the study, that people found the $500 offer to be less credible than a $250 offer. They're more likely to kind of just ignore it and put it to the side. But that's still a very surprising result for us and not at all what we would have expected. The last thing that we found interesting was that the medium matters. So we sent out flyers to start, and then we followed up with like a letter. So a flyer is like a nice, glossy, well-designed thing that a marketing firm helped us put together. It got almost completely ignored by everybody, whether they were getting a financial offer or not. In June of last summer, we actually followed up with a proper letter. So like a formal letter signed by the fire district chief. That turned out to be the big difference maker in terms of response rates. So I'm going to wrap it there. Happy to talk more about my work in general, but hopefully this gives you a sense for the ways in which academics and policymakers are maybe trying to start to collaborate and to work together on some of these important questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Baylis. We'll now move on to Michael's presentation. So Michael, if you are ready, you can take it away.
Great, thank you. Mine will be an audio presentation, no visual component, unless you look at the trees behind me. So hi, I'm Michael Wolfe. I've got a few hats that have been shared in the introduction there, but I'll just highlight that being a city councillor for a city that's over 200,000 people, it wasn't just an easy thing to get into. For me, it was actually a journey that started probably 20 years ago when I was out of high school as a UBC student. I was trying to apply what I was learning to where I lived and my other hobbies. And I fell in love with this natural area very close to where I've grown up, spent my whole life, referred to as the Garden City lands, a large square block in the middle of city of Richmond. And 20 years ago, there was a proposal to turn it into condo towers, trade and convention center, turf fields. And I was learning about conservation biology at the time. And it really spoke to me that there was a need for someone to speak on behalf of the lands. So someone needed to learn what was there, share with others, communicate with decision makers, policy makers, and present another option. And it led to the formation of a group of individuals who came from all sorts of backgrounds and put together a plan that challenged the status quo, what all the levels of government were planning to do with it before. And that led to what now, 20 years later, is like this jewel in our city. It's a fully functional farm utilized by Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and they have greenhouses and areas where they grow. There's community trails on the land, and there's a huge section, about 25 acres of, 25 hectares of natural space where the bog ecology is being allowed to store the carbon that it's been doing for all these years, and also to give opportunity for people to find ways to enhance it, to protect its habitat. And so I just thought I'd start with that as a way in. So 20 years running in 10 elections, federal, provincial, municipal, trying to understand myself what policies come from these different levels, how do they intersect, how can this one piece of property or one issue factor into these other areas? So the agricultural land reserve provincially, for an example there. And I've failed in many election attempts to try and convince to become a policymaker or a leader in a community, but it didn't deter me. It showed me that there was still a valuable need, because the majority of people in politics, from my experience, are very similar and lack the action for climate change issues. And so I stuck with it. All the while, I am still a high school teacher, where I connect with the youth by day and work at City Hall in the evenings. And it really grounds me into their future, the decisions that have been made that they'll be wrestling with, and give it an opportunity for me to find ways to support them and make the change now for them. And I'll now just go into some of the other connections I think I can speak to as public responses to climate change. So every area has its own risks, as Patrick highlighted there. Fire risk is, yes, Richmond, it has potential for fire risk. There was a large trestle bridge that was on fire last weekend that released a whole lot of toxins and carbon into the atmosphere. But regardless, I'd say Richmond has more concern over water as a risk. So apply it to the area you're interested in or working for. But what are the risks, and how do they relate to climate, and how can that translate to educating the public for the steps that they can take, the ways that they can prepare. And so in our regard for water, we have all these potential issues. Richmond is a collection of islands in the middle of the Fraser River. one of the largest rivers on the continent. And so we've got the freshet, the heavy flushing out of fresh water off of the mountains that happens with the snow melt and heavy rain seasons. Then there's the concern with the ocean because we have that on the west side, and there's storm surges, there's high tide, king tides, and the concern for when that matches with the high stream flow. And then you get the water from above, the heavy rainfall events, those atmospheric rivers that put a lot of stress on pump stations and if they can handle that capacity of water. And then you translate that to how the public needs to respond to ensure that their properties are able to soak up some of the water, meaning they have permeable space and they don't pave and asphalt over everything. So just like yesterday at City Council, we approved basically increasing our potential population from where we are now, 200,000 to 300,000, just by adding extra homes in the single family home neighborhoods. So all of that is going to put a real strain on the permeable surfaces that we have now, and the trees and the deep roots that they go down. When we do a lot of the densification, we lack that the ability to retain that habitat. And because we're an island, we can't just use crown land adjacent to us to add more green space or that. We really have to find unique ways to increase habitat enhancement and habitat compensation, which has really been a struggle. We also have impacts with the port and the airport because of the location and geography of Richmond. We have challenges with these other jurisdictions that don't have to abide by our rules and also result in a lot more climate impacts from their operation. The city, just a few more points here. The city of Richmond has, and other places have taken the energy component to kind of be something that they can do locally. So for us, we created a Lulu Island, which is our main island of Richmond, the Lulu Island Energy Company, and it started really around geothermal and is now transitioning to sewer heat recovery as a way to not rely on natural gas and electricity, but utilize heat that's much easier to get without producing emissions, and then to pump that heat or cooling air into buildings that are part of the growing network. We've done the public EV charging stations. We just approved carbon credit selling component to that. We have a solar EV charger as well. We're enhancing our green fleet. Every time we can retire a vehicle, we try and replace it with a fully electric one if they exist, and if not, hybrids. And we, in circular economy, we've said as a city that we were one of the first national climate action leaders in Canada, and so we're constantly trying to push that and stay on top of our leadership role that we need to hold, because we're the municipal government, and I think when it comes to what's on the ground and what impacts people's lives, the waste, the water, electricity that they get, a lot of it falls to the utilities that we provide for them. So I will leave it at that, and yeah, I look forward to some of the questions that come in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Michael. And I'm sure that I walked around the Garden City lands, the perimeter at one point. So it's nice to know that there's a connection there. So as we move on, thank you for sharing again your robust knowledge and unique perspectives with us. The stories that you've shared are both relevant and enlightening, and has brought forth a lot of new and transformational information to digest.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both. That was wonderful. So at this point, we'll open up the floor to everyone to ask questions or add to the conversation. But if you would prefer to use the chat, feel free to do so, and we can keep an eye on the chat. But otherwise, feel free to turn on your mic and join the conversation. And maybe while we wait, Michael and Patrick, I know that Rob's real goal for the podcast and then this Viewpoint session was really to have a conversation between the two of you and really see how we can kind of bridge these very different kind of institutional approaches to climate change. And so I'm kind of wondering, based on the podcast, if you've had time to kind of reflect on the conversation that you had with each other and whether or not your thoughts have changed or new ideas have been sparked. And yeah, really what that conversation, I guess, brought to you in your perspective on your institution and your approaches to climate change.
Well, one thing that I brought up last time Patrick and I spoke was a UBC researcher, Dr. Tara Martin, and her study of the Fraser River estuary endangered species, 102 of them that are threatened, and how she equated it with her economic background or her teams, that it would equate to spending $381 million over 25 years to provide the habitat protection and enhancement for those species, and trying to equate that into something that the public can grasp. So $6 per person in Metro Vancouver per year. So I've been really wrestling with that and trying to apply something more specific for like a Richmond habitat compensation project, and trying to get it in one of the future budgetary processes as a way to let people know, here's a new thing we're doing, and here's the very small fraction of your taxes that is going to it, and then maybe that will provide more of a groundswell on people thinking, oh yeah, maybe we should do more like that because it has such a benefit for us and the non-human component and the future generation. So I'm trying to kind of looking for examples or perspectives on utilizing kind of that kind of economic argument for big habitat expenses.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, for the broader category of work in this is called ecosystem services, which I'm sure Michael knows, but just for the audience. And I think it's like one of those concepts that is very easy to kind of wrap your mind around, but the actual quantification of measurement is not so straightforward. And that's like one of the activities that turns out to be very important. It's just like articulating that, this estuary, this riverway, like they're doing important things that have value for people, for animals, and they should be sort of rewarded and, if possible, measured, and when not possible to measure, at least like acknowledged. I guess the thing that I thought about after our conversation had to do with scale. A lot of my work and my colleagues' work, especially the work that it's considered sort of most prestigious, I guess, is the work that characterizes problems and questions at like a regional or national scale. And so that's often the kind of work that gets rewarded in academia. Like, I've done some studies that are at the scale of the entire American West. So saying something about housing policy and wildfire suppression and wildfire costs across the West. And those studies are useful in that they can say something like broad about, the currents of what's happening in these areas and these topics. And I think that's part of our responsibility as academics, but an individual fire manager in one of these areas isn't going to really benefit from that information. It's not that like broad average effect of, let's say, like one home, the effect of having like 1 or 100 homes in the path of a wildfire, which is something we measure in one of these papers, is not something that like a very specific person in Western Colorado managing wildfire is going to need to think about in their day-to-day. And so part of the reason why I wanted to talk about the study that I talked about earlier today is that it's like, it looks at a much more local scale. And I mean, I think both types of research are important, but but the type of research that kind of focuses on specific communities might be more applicable to those communities and to other communities than the type of research that is across like a large province or multiple provinces or states or whatever. Anyway, the reason why that links, I think, is because a lot of the work that Michael describes is, definitionally City of Richmond, and the academic work that is going to be beneficial to the kind of work that you and the people you work with are doing is going to be stuff that's at least like close enough to that context to be relevant. Those are my ruminations. Anyway, it sort of leads into, I saw Melody had a question for me, so I can just keep talking.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll read it out quick for everyone listening, but Melody has a question for Patrick. I'd love to hear a bit more about your work on wildland fire risk mitigation and how the ideas you discussed in your presentation could also be applied to other geographic and socioeconomic contexts. What advice would you give to other jurisdictions in woodland or WI or areas dealing with similar issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great kind of segue. We're hopeful that we can be sort of quantitatively specific about the population that we look at in this study. It's Central Oregon, which means it's white and low income on average. There's of course exceptions to both of those things, but that's like ethnically and economically what we're talking about. Kind of semi-rural, and so by being quantitatively specific about those things, I can at least tell you like what we find is probably applicable in places, that sort of look like our study area in terms of fire risk and demographics of the population. So you could extrapolate this, I think, pretty reasonably to this type of semi-rural area up and down the American West, with kind of similar demographics. Maybe a place like the very wealthy Marin County that's coastal California has wildfire risk. We might not see exactly the same type of behavior or responses. In terms of other advice, I think one of the things we learned from the study that we didn't know before is, and I didn't mention this in my sort of brief recap, but we basically had very little success reaching lower income, lower ability populations. That is basically, by that I mean people who are kind of less able to do some of the work required for defensible space mitigation. So this turned out to be a really large barrier, and I guess mobility is probably the right word here. Like being able to clear a juniper bush from your property is not something everybody can do. And places that can develop programs that can assist elderly homeowners or residents in making these kind of improvements or mitigations are probably going to have a larger overall impact and more success, because those are often the homes that need it most.
Thanks so much, Melody. And
I'll just tack on in regards to Richmond and fire risk. One of the unique situations that we've had is the homeless population, and the ones specifically who live outdoors and choose year-round to live outdoors. And one of the locations where they've done that is in woodlands or in bog properties, bog forests. And when the only method to heat or make warm up food is an open fire on the ground in a bog, it presents a major risk for wildfire. And that fire is also unique in the way where bog fires or peatland tundra fires can last for years and last through winter seasons as well. So we did have a really significant fire a few years ago as a result of these types of fires, and the response was to put a barbed wire fence around that whole property to keep people out in physical blockage. It doesn't go around all the woodland areas, so that population of people have move to a different area, and so the risk remains out there.
Thank you both so much. I see your hand, Gabrielle. Please go ahead.
Hi, both. This question is a little bit more for Michael, I suppose, and especially I was really interested as you were talking about your experience of like doing conservation work in Richmond in particular, and now in a sort of the position that you're in now. How do you sort of strike that balance between sort of pushing for like bold environmental policy, but also coming up against, like you were saying, the need for the development of housing, especially during the housing crisis? Do you find that there's a lot of like competing interests, or that you're able to sort of maintain that sort of boldness in environmental advocacy, or that it's sort of becoming more complicated? I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yes, it's definitely become complicated, and I have been able to hold on to the conservation approach and make really strong positions when it comes down to the vote, because that's what everything in municipal government really falls to, is making motions or supporting something or not, and then backing it up with your reasons. So I am likely the one who's the odd one out on voting for most things, just because I demand more, or I want these residential projects to do better than just approaching it like a blank slate. I see that all the time, and I use that phrase all the time, because developers will come in and they want to build what they want because they're allowed to, and they want to get rid of everything on the site. And like other cities, there's tree protection bylaws. So if you take a tree down, you got to replace it. And we have 2-for-1 replacement and 3-for-1 if it's a significant tree and all that stuff. And so every time there's a townhouse development or something, I look through all the stats and come up with my own little summary saying, well, they're taking down 64 trees. They're supposed to plant 130. They're only making room for 6. So they're going to give us this much money in lieu, cash in lieu, for the other trees. So I'm not supporting it, because in the end, where does that pool of money go, and where do those trees go? And do they actually grow, or do they just little stick trees in sandy crap soil? And so I have to repeat myself, and I get people rolling their eyes across the table, and they go, oh, here he's ranting about trees again. And then I have to make the point that I'm going to be voting against this. And then the odd time where someone does find a unique way to keep the row of trees at the property line, and even though they have to raise the property up because of sea level requirements, they find ways to taper it down or put a boardwalk around the base of the trees and make it work. And then I can highlight and say, this is the type of developer that we need to showcase to provide leadership to the other ones that aren't there yet. And then, so that's kind of my way of advocating. I also will look at the BC Energy Step Code. What level are they going to plan to achieve? Are they just doing the minimum because they have to? If that's the case, I'll speak that out and say, this isn't good enough for 2024. And then explain examples where similar projects have gone to the next level of energy level or zero energy level. So, and then just one other point then I'll share is advocating. There's a lot of, I find, to advocate in confidential or closed meetings as well, that the public doesn't see. And some of those things are would be very significant because they involve lawsuits, like suing big oil and challenging utilities like Fortis and BC Hydro. And so there's a lot. Yeah, that's the part of the complexity that I didn't, know about it until you're in the position. So thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I see that we have a question here from our director, Natasha. Natasha, you can go ahead and share your question, please.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. I think this is maybe more for Patrick, but Michael, you can chime in as well. Looking at your slides, Patrick, and how you approached people, and I know it's all about education, right? So from those leaflets to letters, have you thought about the social media and whether that's one of the avenue you would use to address the public? So I guess I have two questions. So that's one. The other one, you also talked about the aging population and some of the people that cannot do things. So how much you rely on human capacity to do things together, and whether there are ways of mobilizing people to actually work as a community rather than individual homes. You need to do this and you decide, or because just on the island, right? Everyone depends on everyone else. So we are part of this planet, or however wide or narrow you want to look at the location where we are. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the questions. I'll start with social media. We did think about social media. So the fundamental problem that a lot of these communities face is establishing contact, which was a surprise to me. I was like, can we just have your email list or your, everybody on your Facebook group? And they're like, well, that's 3% of our population. So making contact has been a real challenge. And the main reason why we went the mail route, the snail mail route, is because that is the only comprehensive directory of members of the fire district that we have access to, or that they have access to. Once in contact, the fire district typically will try to enroll the person who got in touch with them, the person in their district, into their Community Connect program. This is pretty typical for these types of districts, which is, it's a program where you're on the email list basically, and you can join the Facebook group, and the fire district can contact you that way. And so that's like I guess the way to think about what we were doing was kind of establishing contact to make all of that other communication possible. But yeah, I mean, we're thinking about this for future partners, other partners elsewhere, and just recognizing that their existing communication channels reach a very small proportion of their population, and that's obviously a problem. Your second question was about kind of people working together to do some of this mitigation behavior. I mean, you're right. It really is the setting where that would make a lot of sense, especially because risk spills over as well. So if we live next to each other and I have a pile of slash on the edge of my land close to your house, that's probably more of a problem for you than it is for me. And that's a real issue in a lot of these areas. I would say the culture in a lot of the areas we're studying is a little bit less maybe collectivist than you might see on the island. And so encouraging that kind of collaboration isn't always very successful. But one thing that has been interesting along these lines, and we didn't get to do any work with this in Jackson County at least, but one of the things that they do is that they, in some summers, will recruit a youth corps that will go around and assist people with this type of mitigation work. And that's a place where folks who were just out of high school can get paid and go do work to help people in their community. So yeah, it exists. We weren't able to study it this time.
Thank you.
I'll just add from my perspective, the mobilization of people has, going back to that example of the Garden City lands and 20 years ago, and getting people kind of excited about another possibility for this unique property. So it ended up being the largest round of public hearings during my lifetime, at least in Richmond, where it went for 5 nights. public hearings starting at 7, being I think at 7 or 11 o'clock. They postponed them to the next night because there were so many speakers and so many people who were kind of latching on that there's something else we can do instead of more of the same, everything getting the towers and paving everything over and losing more green space. Here's a potential different option. And it was amazing the voices that we heard and people so passionate about it that would come out for 5 nights to sit and listen and only get their little 5 minutes to speak. But it just ignited such a unique kind of momentum in the city. It was supported by the newspapers because we used to get newspapers then, and the articles were really well covered. Now it's such a challenge to get good news stories out there and connect, because there's just so many distractions and so many other medium for people to latch onto to get their news. So it's really become so complex and a struggle where it used to be, okay, wait till the newspaper comes out and it'll give you the next chapter of this saga. And so I find one thing I used to do was create monthly tours, and I'd lead people, whoever wanted to come. I'd say come every month if you can, because it's incredible the difference that you can see in the lands and the stages of the plant growth. And it became a fascination for people and taking their families. Policymakers at the time, city staff were coming, and I'm not part of that so much anymore, but that group still leads study. They're finding endangered plant species and trying to find ways to mow the land differently. So they give opportunity for students to do research and test plots. They build these little mini pocket forests called Miyawaki, where they do really dense planting. And I think our city now has 4 of them. So and those hands-on opportunities are really valuable to get people out and meeting their neighbors and doing something for the common good. So I just thought I'd share that. Thanks.
How large is a jump from the passion to actually the policy? For you and for you, Michael, and for you, Patrick, like working with those such diverse groups?
Well, I find it a good mesh, having very young kids, having youth at the school, and then trying to work with these adults that are in a more structured mindset and trying to kind of crack away at some of the staff portfolios and try and fuse things in there so that at the school district level or at the city level, we can hold people responsible for providing opportunities for the public to get engaged with climate action. So I find it's very complicated, but it's working for me.
I mean, one of the nice things about being a college professor is that you stay in contact with people in the like 18 to 22 demographic who are often quite passionate and interested and engaged with the world. And it's yeah, it's something that I really value about my job.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you for that very rich question, Natasha. I do have a question, and Michael, nothing wrong with being the tree advocate that you are. I have a question for you both. You mentioned the visual impacts of climate change as significant drivers for environmental behavior. Can you discuss any ongoing research or initiatives aimed at leveraging these impacts to foster greater public and policy support for sustainable practices?
I would maybe start with that conversation with kind of energy use and water usage. So helping to present homeowners or users of a space with the data of how much input is required for them to do that task. So for example, like we were early adopters in the water metering. So people were presented on their utility bills how much water they were using, and then they're charged appropriately as opposed to a flat rate. And I think that's one way when it's financially an incentive to not be wasteful. That when you order the size of garbage bin that you put out to the curb, you pay more for having the larger bins. I think there should be even, we could kind of tease with that a little bit and try putting even more incentive to get people to switch down their size of bins, or incentives, benefits for those people who are able to make a year-to-year reduction in energy use or water use. And so I think that's kind of something that the city, just all cities have easy access to do that. And then when it comes to kind of climate action that individuals can take, I'm struggling with that because I'm still trying to get somewhat of like a backyard certification program in the city where people will get a benefit to having ecosystem services on their property, meaning more tree coverage, habitat provision. So if you have a ditch like I do, a ditch can be an incredible habitat for species. I have ducks that nest in mine. I got muskrats. I got a sign up saying caution muskrat crossing, because these are incredible species that we should be partnering with and encouraging, as opposed to many people who treat their ditch ecosystems in a very different way. And I think we need to encourage them with financial incentives to do better.
So the academics, or one of the terms of art for this kind of thing is called green attributes. And the idea is that, you know, every product has an attribute, whether it's a home, like Michael was saying, or a car, or a pen. And some of those attributes are the things we might automatically think of, like, does the home have 2 bedrooms or 3, or does the car have, you know, is it a 2-seater, is it a 4-seater? The pen right in blue or black ink. But then green attributes can be something else, like what was the carbon footprint required to create this object, or, you know, what ecosystem services does this parcel contribute to the environment? And the thing that has always been true is that the more we measure those attributes, those green attributes, the more likely people are to pay attention to them. So measurement and like of the impact of servicing green attributes is not my field, so I can't give you citations off the top of my head. But I can almost assure you that there is work out there that looks at like the effect of, for example, showing people the carbon emissions cost of their trip, or different alternatives to their trip, and looking at how willing people are to you know, travel differently, whether that's like a mode choice question or just taking a different route. Similar for airline emissions. The degree to which those things get measured is a really big factor in how much people pay attention to them. So like Michael was saying, like if you can actually put a number on the value of the ecosystem services that a home is producing, or get people credits for that in some way, that's going to be an important driver of behavior. The wildfire setting, or the wildfire version of this that I think of is one that actually has some regulatory bite now. So in California, when you sell a home in a wildfire-prone area, you now have to pass a defensible space inspection. If you don't pass that inspection, you can't sell your home. That is the single most powerful driver of defensible space establishment in that state. And it's the only place I know of that has that kind of requirement at this point. They put it in 2021. But tying that kind of like environmental disclosure to the real estate process has been a very effective driver of behavior change, and one of the few like truly impactful levers we've seen in mitigation in that area. So the combination of measurement and where possible regulation is like extremely effective.
Right. Thank you both so much. That was really helpful. I know we have only a few more minutes. I'm just wondering if we can end on maybe some like I'm also thinking of a classroom, like maybe perhaps Patrick, this is more about your logistics inside of the classroom. But also Michael, I know you have 2 young kids at home. And so I'm wondering about like really practical action items that you include either in your home or in your classroom that like everyone here can take forward as well, just to make kind of small changes or encourage those small changes. So whether it's like an assignment or a conversation, yeah, what that looks like to you in terms of making those small steps forward.
Great. Yeah, I am a real proponent of mapping. So I really value people mapping out their neighborhood or their space, and knowing what's there and creating a baseline. I remember going to many presentations with Dr. Daniel Pauly at UBC, and his work with the shifting baseline syndrome. And if you don't know about it or you haven't mapped it, you end up becoming falling into the trap that, oh, this is the new normal, and whatever was in the past is lost. So it's for me, it's always a value to get people to know what's there before it's too late. Just like the Garden City lands, I had to go out there, not prepared for what I was going to discover, but I had to go there and document it and collect samples and show people, slideshow and or the pictures, or bring the actual plant to them. The other thing I had mentioned is what I always like to do with students, for example, is the ecological footprint. Again, Dr. Bill Reese, I remember him presenting at UBC on that way back when, and getting people to understand their own footprint, and how that I can now apply that to city facilities, and how we need to get a building footprint. We need to measure it, we need to benchmark it, and then work to improve the energy and output of that building. Yeah, so I'd share those 2.
I think I have sort of a similar, I mean, I love the mapping thing. Actually, at first I thought you said napping, and I was like, I can get on board with that. But I agree. I think mapping is and exploring is a terrific way to get to know where you live and appreciate it. Related to the ecological footprint, there's a lot of calculators out there that will, help one calculate your carbon footprint, for example, and that can be illuminating for students and for me. I mean, I think one of the things that might not be obvious is kind of the difference between short haul and long haul flights, and how per mile, per kilometer travel, short haul flights are much more intensely carbon emitting than long haul flights. So putting that together, and then you can kind of input roughly your diet and get a sense for what that means carbon emission wise. And it's a really important environmental impact, but it's one of several important environmental impacts. So it's a good starting point anyway for thinking about the impacts of climate change. And the other thing that I try to emphasize is, aside from individual actions, just like how important collective action is, and participation in the political process. And I mean, yeah, Michael knows that better than me and most people, but like the value of being like an active and engaged political participant and engaging your peers on issues that are important to you, especially when it comes to these types of issues, which can be a little bit harder to grasp in our day-to-day lives, at least right now, maybe not in 20 years, is maybe the most important impact that any one person can have.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both so much. And mapping, that's something that I'll definitely look into myself. So that's all the time that we have for our Viewpoint session today. We'd like to thank our two incredible panelists, Michael and Dr. Baylis, for your time and your invaluable contributions and wisdom. We'd also like to thank everyone here for joining us, our conversation today, and for also such thought-provoking questions that you had as well, and sharing your thoughts about economics, policy, and climate justice. So if you have any questions or wish to learn more about our team here at LDDI, please connect with us on Twitter or LinkedIn and send us an email, or you can visit our website. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the sunshine that's here for now and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.